As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. While scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon Ingrid Clayton's very funny Instagram reel about a product called Fix Your Partner. Watching it made me feel so seen. So I signed up for her newsletter, watched her stand-up therapy variety show, and as I did, discovered her memoir, Believing Me. After reading it while traveling last fall, I knew we were soul sisters who were meant to meet. So I was overjoyed when she said yes to being on my show. Ingrid is a psychotherapist who publishes for Psychology Today. She writes and speaks about complex trauma and the fawning response. In addition to raising her beautiful son, Ingrid believes that gaining the courage to write Believing Me is her greatest achievement to date. After spending time with her, I would add to the list her ability to be authentically herself, no matter where she is or what she's doing. As you prepare to listen to our episode, I have a few questions for you. Have you ever doubted your own experience or felt like if you just did the right thing, you'd be good enough and the problems in your relationship would end? Is there something about yourself you struggle to believe in? While writing, have you ever considered the story your body wants to tell? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now, let's get to my conversation with Ingrid Clayton. Hey writers, have you started a memoir only to get lost in a sea of endless stories that seem to go nowhere? Are you wading through the messy middle of the revision process and searching for your narrative arc? Have you received vague feedback from agents or publishers or been explicitly told your book contains a lot of interesting and well-written stories that follow in and then format? The solution to all three problems is the same. Find your memoir's beats. But for most writers, it isn't as simple as buying a copy of Blake Schneider's book, Save the Cat, and following his formula. In fact, many memoirists find certain beats confusing, and some wonder if this contrived Hollywood formula will work for their book. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to teach Create Your Memoir's Beat Sheet on Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. During this 90-minute webinar, you'll learn how to capitalize on the benefits of a beat sheet, scrap the parts that might not serve your story, discover how a beat sheet can be used even with a nonlinear memoir, and gain confidence as you shape your material into a compelling book. Best of all, this webinar is just $25. You heard me, $25. That includes the webinar, a PDF of my slides, and a comprehensive workbook that will help you apply these principles to your story, no matter the structure you've chosen. So if you want to tame your material, find your narrative arc, and feel confident that the book you're querying is truly the story you wish to tell, go to janefriedman.com and click online classes, or make it easy on yourself and click on the link in the show notes. Ingrid, I am so happy to have you on the podcast. So welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. It is so good to see you.
Lovely to meet you. I love the name of the podcast. I'm so happy to be here.
So I want to begin by giving you a chance to tell us a little bit about your book, and I'm going to be holding it up for people who are listening. Believing Me, and I have this little tab in there. If I were to open up, you would see all of these things that I underlined because I love this book so much, and I want people to read it. So I don't want to give away any spoilers. So I'm going to talk about specific things that spoke to me. But what would you like us to know about your book?
Believing Me, it's my memoir on complex trauma, which is basically relational trauma, sometimes called childhood trauma or developmental trauma, in the context of narcissistic abuse. And I am a trauma therapist. I'm a clinical psychologist. I did not set out to write this book. I had no intentions of writing a memoir on childhood trauma, but it came for me. It came for me so fast and furious. And when it did, I just couldn't stop writing. And I knew that something important was happening. And it's like I answered a calling that I literally didn't know where it was taking me, but I knew it was really important and I had to listen. So this is the book that came out of that process.
Well, the fact that you said it was a calling, this is something that called to me, is something that happens to most writers. And the books that I've worked on, it just says like, you will do this, right? And when we follow
Yeah.
that, something magical happens. And I think the magic within your book is that you describe this experience so well that it
Mm.
mirrored mine. And so some of the
Mm.
things that really spoke to me, and I'm not going to describe them in great detail because again, I want people to read the book, is this relationship the narrator has with her stepfather, you know, the complexities of it, and this idea of, I really want to be seen in this great way, and I'm working hard. And if I just do this one thing, I'll be
Mm.
good enough. And yet it never happens. And there's so many times that you set us up for that failure so well, where it's like, I, as the reader who's lived in this kind of experience, goes, oh, I know where this is going. But yet the narrator is like, yes, it's going to work, and this is going to be okay. And I'm going to get what my needs met this time, only to have it come crashing down. And
Yes.
that really spoke to me as, and then you have this scene in the therapist's office.
Oh, yes.
Oof. Oh, like just reading it. And I was looking at your excellent piece on Psychology Today about self-gaslighting, and that I was like feeling that punch in the heart again, because I
Mm.
had an experience with my family where we went to group therapy that often when you're in these family systems does not go well.
Right.
And it was just an absolute nightmare. And you
Oh,
describe the nightmare.
it really was a nightmare. I think it went as bad as it possibly could have gone, and it only made things worse. Yeah.
And that happens so often. And, you know, and I'm, my heart is connecting with you both as a person who's experienced it, and also as a, you know, knowing that that was your experience, and all of the people that I've worked with over the years who've
Mm.
also had that experience. It's just, it's
Mm.
so tough. And one of the things you describe in your book so well is the experience of self-gaslighting, which is one of the things I want to talk with you about today. But
Mm.
before we talk about self-gaslighting, can you describe gaslighting for us in case someone's not familiar with that term?
Yes, yes. I just want to back up a tiny bit and speak to what you were saying about that familiar pattern of, this time it's going to go well, I'm going to get my needs met. You know, I'd be lying if I didn't say that that was embedded even in the writing process for me, right? Here I am well into my 40s working on childhood trauma, and half of this is a calling, and I know it's a calling towards healing. But the other half of me is going, maybe this will fix it, Lisa. Maybe if I look under every rock and I have every conversation and I do the research and I write it as well as I possibly can, I'm going to get the magical thing that I always thought would fix it all along, and it being me. And so I think the reason that people are seeing their story reflected, themselves reflected, is because I was so steeped in that very same pattern as I was writing. I was so close to it that, you know, sometimes when you're 85 steps down the road, it's sort of, you can't really relate to that feeling anymore. But I was so in that feeling, and it hasn't entirely gone away. I haven't been able to shed that completely. But to get back to the gaslighting piece, so gaslighting is very common with narcissistic abuse and beyond. It's a form of emotional, psychological manipulation or minimization. And it's really designed to make somebody question their own reality. And it sounds really simple, but I think it was Dr. Ramani and I, who she specializes in narcissistic abuse, were having a conversation. It's like a parasite. It just takes hold inside your body, and it changes everything, the way you see yourself, the way you see the world. It changes your narrative. And because of that, in my experience, even though most of my trauma happened largely in childhood, it had taken such deep roots in my body that I began to self-gaslight. And what that sounded like was, maybe it wasn't that bad. You know, it wasn't as bad as this other person's experience. And it's like we hold this trauma measuring stick, you know, like, oh no, clearly they had trauma, but I didn't have real trauma. So I start minimizing. I go, well, he never said that exact thing, or I never had bruises, or I start trying to make sense of it in a way that my experience fits what happened. Because what happened is that everybody else around me, the important key players, were gaslighting me. And they followed that reality that they were spouting. And so it's just so deeply confusing. And this is true of gaslighting, but it's also true of childhood trauma generally, that we're wired for relationship, right? As a species, we live with our caregivers until 18 plus years. Like that doesn't really happen anywhere else in the animal kingdom. So our bodies are designed to need and rely on our caregivers for a very long time. So a part of that equation is that if I need you to survive, I can't really see you as that bad. I will make it my fault. And in me, that felt like this split, this divide, almost like I was cracked in half. There was this part of me that had, even as a child, a very rational, kind of logical, like this is wrong, this is bad, it's so obvious understanding. I even knew some of the roots related to alcoholism and things. My 8th grade term paper, I called alcoholism the family disease, right? I'm 12 years old, I'm figuring this stuff out. But the other half of me, the experiential part, the nervous system, fight, flight, or freeze part of me, was learning how to be in relationship by being in relationship. And so it started to sort of dull that more rational part of the thinking mind to where I just go, well, no, it must not be that, because this is what actually happened. And then I run with that as my story to some degree. It must not have been that bad.
Oh, that is such a good definition. And I think it's so important for us to create these definitions for people, because words like gaslighting and self-gaslighting, we hear them everywhere. And I don't
Yeah,
think most people really understand what they mean and how much this is tied to our survival, especially when this happens when we're kids. Like, it has to be my fault because I have to survive and I cannot see you as bad. And
right,
so, how we perpetuate that in our relationships, even after we leave, because, there's a lot of times where people think, oh, well, if I just get out of this relationship, my life's going to be all better. And then, of course,
right.
you bring yourself with you, and then
Yes.
you do that to yourself. And I can certainly say that that happened to me in many different ways in my own life. But
Mm,
you said something that I think is really important for writers to hear, and that is that writing this book was helpful and it was healing, and it didn't necessarily give you this magic bullet of complete healing, or that you could get
mm,
it right this time. That so many people start writing in that way. They think that when I write my book, I'm going to be healed.
mhm.
When people start reading my book and they tell me how good it is or it speaks to them, I am going to be completely healed. And that this process is going to do something for them that can't happen, right? It's
Mm,
unrealistic. It's not that there can't be healing through the writing
yeah,
process,
right.
but we're never complete. And that's another thing I really love about your book is you do not tie it up in a bow. It's
Right.
very realistic and it's very hopeful in the way you end. It's not like you're ending on a dark note. And
Mhm.
it's a very powerful note, but it's a note that acknowledges that we can change, but maybe not everyone else will. We're not taking everyone with us. And that's another, I think,
Mm,
secret wish that people have. Like, if I share my story, the people who hurt me will see me and they will see my
right.
pain. And then that will also be healed. That relationship piece will be healed. And that doesn't happen. So, what I often tell people is when you're starting a writing project, especially if you're working on a memoir, is
Mm,
to create an intention that is about you.
mm,
What is it that you want to change inside yourself in terms of a belief you have about yourself or
mm,
a way that you operate in the world, so that the process can
mhm,
be about your healing, but
mm.
also to be realistic that this isn't going to fix everything.
Yeah, I love that. And in my experience, both as a writer and a therapist, I would just add one more thing. And that is, I think I needed that magical thinking to pull me far enough along in the process that other pieces of actual healing were sort of coming on board, and I was seeing myself and not just looking outside of myself. And so I would say we don't even need to have that clear intention at the beginning. Go ahead and have a little magical thinking at the beginning. I liken it to when I was in early sobriety. I had some real magical thinking about what was going to happen on these 90-day markers, or, by the first year. And you know what? If I didn't think that my life was just going to be all wrapped up in a bow by 90 days, I don't know that I would have ever got to 30 days. Right. But by the time I did have 90 days, I was like, okay, well, it may not be that thing that I thought I wanted, but look, I haven't had a drink or a drug in 90 days, and I didn't think that was possible. So it's a both and for me,
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, is you have to have some sort of magical thinking and hope that makes you feel like something is going to come of this, that fits your dreams and your hopes for yourself. And to figure out, what is the piece that's about you.
That's right.
Because I think that's the piece that what I observe in writers sometimes is that there's this belief that something external is going to happen that may or may not happen, and then it sets people up for failure. But yeah, you have to have some sort of amazing hope beyond what seems possible or reasonable in order to do these things, because writing a book is hard in the same way that getting sober is hard, or surviving an experience like you did with a narcissistic parent. All of these things are really hard, and if we don't have some level of magical thinking that helps us get to that next place, we're probably going to fall into hopelessness.
Yeah, exactly. It propelled me far enough down the road that I was like, okay, now I'm on the road. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah. So let's talk about your book, the writing of your book.
Yeah.
So one of the things you said, was fairly late in the book when you started, you had gone through all of these different things you'd done to heal yourself. And then you started writing the book, and it was this all, encompassing experience in the beginning, getting through that first draft. And then you started the revision process.
Ooh, the worst. The worst. I wrote another book before this one, and it was very academic. In fact, it was based on my dissertation. So it was like, okay, chapter 1, here's the outline, fill it out, done, moving on. Like, I think I wrote that, and it's not really fair to say because, of course, I took years in graduate school to do the research and write the dissertation. But when I took that and rewrote it for a book for Hazelden Press, it maybe took me 9 months. So that was my thinking about this memoir. I was like, I've written a book. I know how to do this. I know what I want to say. And it was not that process at all. And I've never written a memoir. I've never written first person like that. So I had to just wrap my head around what that looks like and what that means. And I had to take a couple writing classes. And the one thing I thought was sort of funny in the writing classes that I took that were all memoir focused is that the teacher always started by saying, now this is not therapy. And I was like, yes, it is. Everybody in this room is here because they're working out something. And I get they maybe didn't want to, they want to have boundaries in place, and it's different in that way. But I was like, this is the most impactful therapy I've ever done. So let's also give it its due in that way. But there was a huge learning curve. And I started going to some writers groups, I think initially, before I gave it to an editor. I didn't know the difference between developmental editing and line editing. And so I had to learn all of that. But honestly, it felt like, and my husband can attest to this, how many times I came home sobbing, like racked with the most painful. I was like, what am I doing? I'm trying to tell a story where I was discarded. I wasn't seen. It was deeply, deeply painful. Nobody cared back then. Okay. Why would they care now? And why would I put myself through this process where not only am I retelling the same story that got totally cast aside, but I'm trying to do it with like pretty words and interesting sentences. It truly felt like this is pain porn. This is the worst idea that I've ever had. And how painful that was to sit with people looking at your deepest, truest experiences, but from a very objective place, like, I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't ready for it. And it was devastating. It was devastating. And I had to put it away and go, I can't even keep doing this because it's too hard. And then I would tell my husband, I'm done. I'm not going to keep writing. I can't do this. And he would go, okay. And he knew that, give me a little bit of time. And I'd be like, oh, okay, fine. I'm going to go back to the page and take in some of what they're saying about how to write a story for the reader. And maybe there was a way for me to marry what felt both very important for me to say and to own, and do it in a way that I could offer it to a reader, which is a different thing.
Yeah, it's a completely different thing. And what I often tell writers is that there's two parts to the memoir writing process. Part one is where you're bearing witness to your own experience. You are really trying to understand what it's like and feel the feelings that you were not able to feel. Because when you're writing in scene and you are writing vividly, it's not something that happened in the past, especially from the perspective of your nervous system. It's happening now. There is a part of you, the wounded part of you, that is reliving it every single time you write it, every single time you read it. It's a very powerful, visceral experience. And often those early stages, we don't know what it means. And yet, when you go to a writing workshop, people are like, I want to know the function of this scene, or how does this fit within the larger narrative arc? Or they'll ask you all of these questions, which can feel antithetical to what you're trying to do, which is just figure out, what is my truth? What is my experience? So that's one piece of the writing process.
One of the most painful critiques that I had, I mean, I could just break down crying about it right now if I think about it. One of the things that came to me was like every single piece of evidence of bad behavior that my stepdad ever exhibited. It was like my memory needed to catalog every single painful thing that happened. And some feedback that I got early on from this writers group, she was like, you know what, we all know this guy. We don't need so many examples. And it floored me because I was like, you've only read whatever, 10, 20 pages. And you're telling me that based on that little bit of writing, you already know this guy and you don't need so many examples. Then why did I live with it, Lisa, for all of those decades and tell 8 million therapists and form an intervention and all of these things? I just couldn't hold how both of those things were true. And it was devastating. I was like, what do you mean you don't need so many examples? Because why did they not feel the same way? Oh, we all know this guy. Of course, he's, this womanizing, whatever, however they saw him. And it was just one of, I think, probably many, many moments of, it felt like I just walked into a brick wall, and it's interesting even to hear you talk about like, well, this is what I tell people. And these are stages of the process, and going, gosh, I didn't have that. I didn't know. I wish that I had met you 5 years before the writing wanted to happen, right? So I had that scaffolding to sort of build up and go, oh yeah, this is a part of the process, but I had none of that. So it was all just happening internally. And the other thing I'm really struck by hearing you talk about being a witness is how much I have found that the writing process, to your point, it feels like it's happening now, which is exactly what happens with trauma, that we don't know any sense of time. The body just goes, it's happening now, which is what I felt as I was writing. But as a trauma therapist, I've been really interested that the way you write a scene with the senses is the same language that we use in somatic experiencing, for instance, in trauma therapy. And so I was not consciously, but I was utilizing these really important principles of trauma therapy that were a little bit of scaffolding, right? As I was figuring this out by myself, that I'm using the senses to help me process things, like I said, as a mid 40-year-old person that I'd never processed because I wasn't developmentally capable of processing way back then as a child and an adolescent. And I also believe there's something to the typing and the writing itself as perhaps a method of bilateral stimulation, which is what we use in EMDR therapy, which is just right, left, rhythmic patterns, right? That you're sort of just doing that as you go, which helps the brain process from right to left hemisphere. Trauma gets stuck, in the side of the brain where it can't cross over and move through, which is also why it feels stuck in time. So I think the writing process itself is so fascinating for how it mirrors these things that we know in the world of trauma therapy, and that I was able to do in solitude at my kitchen table between me and my laptop.
And I'm so glad you had all of that wisdom to counteract these things
Yes.
that were absolutely devastating because
Yeah.
most people don't know. And I
Right.
think there are a lot of excellent, well meaning writing instructors who just don't have this background in
Right.
trauma to be able to provide this kind of languaging around. Hey, where are you in your writing process? Okay, this is the kind of feedback you need, is that we need to help
Right.
you understand what's actually happening, like the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, how, and what's going
Mm,
on there, or how can we help this scene make sense, rather than
mm,
talking about, okay, how do you develop a character across an arc and when is too much. Because early on, I think that when you're a trauma survivor, there is a way that you need to catalog it for yourself. And I
yes.
caution people sometimes, because I do see this on the other side where people start writing about their traumas, and trauma writing can beget trauma writing, and they do it one after the other and are writing about all of these really difficult experiences without having the scaffolding around them, without having some sort of
Mm,
grounding principle. And then what happens is they become very traumatized by the writing
right.
process. They don't feel grounded, and then they hate their writing and they don't want to work in their projects. So what I tell people is, you have to learn how to ground yourself. First
Yes.
and foremost, you need to understand, where am I today and how am I feeling today? Think about what you want to write, all the different things you could write about. And the best writing is going to happen when how you're feeling today, in terms of your energy and your optimism and your sense of grounding, is greater than the intensity of the writing you plan to do. You have the capacity to do that
Yeah.
work because it takes, right? Writing about trauma takes from you, and you're going to
Yes.
end your writing sessions absolutely exhausted. And
Mm,
that's because of what's happening in your nervous system and the fact that you are reliving. So I love that you talked about that piece and how there's all of these things that you have to catalog and think through. And I'm doing this webinar series with Jane Friedman, and I've talked several times about somatic processing
mm,
and trauma therapy and the importance of developing these skills
yes.
I personally say in advance, or early on in the
Yeah.
process. And it's
Yes.
not that if you're in the middle of writing something you can't do it, but the earlier you learn how to ground,
Mm,
the more ease you're going to have in the process. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, because there's always going to be these painful parts. But
right.
when you get to the pain, you can say, oh, yeah, there it is. And
Mm,
okay, yeah, this sucks and it hurts and I'm going through it, but I know what to do to bring myself back to the
that's
present.
right. Oh, I think those tools are so important. And I haven't really thought about it that way. Because I talk about those things all day long with my clients, I did just intuitively, I think, do some of those things. And I don't know that I would have made it through without. I don't think I would have been able to continue the writing.
And I'm so glad you say that, and I really want people to hear the importance of that, because so many people have this dream of completing a memoir, of doing this kind of writing, and they don't make it to the finish line because
Mm,
of their nervous systems become too overwhelmed with the
yeah.
experience. And you know another thing that I often tell people is, when you're working on a project like this, let it be for you first, and
Mm,
then think about whether or not you're going to publish it after you fully borne witness to your own experience. Because when you get to that next stage, it's about the reader. When you're writing a book, when it's finished, it needs to be the mirror for the reader's soul. So it's
Mhm.
not about what you need from it anymore. It's about what they need, which
Yes.
can be vastly different. And it takes a certain level of distance from your book in order to be able to do things like say, okay, how many, versions of your stepfather acting badly are actually
Right.
needed in the book? And that's
For
different
the
from what,
reader.
yeah,
Mhm.
what does the reader need? And when are they going to be able to get it enough
Yes.
that when the next terrible thing happens, they're like, oh, damn, I know what that guy's going to do. And
Right.
you see how they've set it up for the fall, which you
Right.
do. And you do so well. And I
Oh,
just want to say that you really did that well. And I was just really amazed by the storytelling. I mean,
mm,
I read a lot of books. I don't say
mm.
this all the time, but I was like
Wow.
reading this while I was on a flight and then I was traveling. And I read this very quickly because you pulled me along so well.
Wow. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Well, I definitely mean it. And what do you think you did to bridge that gap between what you needed from this project as the writer to
Yeah.
being able to see what a reader might need?
Well, I think this is where my wearing two hats was useful. The one hat is I'm a trauma survivor. And at some point, I realized I was absolutely writing a trauma memoir, even if I didn't know that in the beginning. But my other hat is I'm a trauma therapist. I'm a clinical psychologist. And so I did think from pretty much the beginning that, yes, this is for me and about me, but I want to do it in a way that it is helpful for other people. And the book is in three parts. It's the what happened, which is the traumatic events piece. But the second piece is the trauma reenactment. It's the trauma responses. It's the things that I carried with me for the rest of my life. And the third part is the healing. And so I think because I had that real desire to use my story as a way to educate, it was helpful, right? And I think the other piece is as a trauma survivor and a trauma therapist, I have not been able to read a lot of the basic texts that people reference all the time in my field because I get too triggered. I check out. I can't read past 4 sentences. And so I kind of intuitively knew that if I can convey some of that really important information through storytelling, it'll make it more accessible. And so I tried, even though I was moving into these three parts that I think also helped move the story along, I tried to do it with as little clinical language as possible. Like the therapist in me was like, I have to have a glossary at the end for people who want that. If they want more information and more context, I had to give it to them. But I wanted to get it out of the way and really try to write it more as a memoir first. But I had all of those layers going on simultaneously, right? In terms of goals and threads. And I think that's what really helped orient me to the reader was as a therapist, I'm oriented to my client, right? I'm like, what's going to be helpful to them? How can I articulate this in a way that they get it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you were talking, and I really like the structure that you created, those three acts, I felt like it took me logically through the story. And also, it served as that mirror for me as the reader going like, oh yeah, yep, I know that part. And oh yeah, this is how it carries over. And this is this part that's the healing. And you put that in so well. But when I think about this, your book mirrors the healing process, right? When you
Mm,
sit down with a new client, that's what you hear first is, you
that's
know,
right.
the
Here's the
trauma
story.
story.
Hmm.
And then you begin to say, okay, how's it showing up in the present? And
Yes.
so I think this is a beautiful model for the work that you do. And you may have not even thought about it that way, but I think it's moving us through
Yeah.
those pieces.
Yeah. I didn't think about it that way in advance, but when the writing started coming and it would wake me up at 3 in the morning, it would come in the shower. It was like they were these separate essays, and I didn't understand how it hung together. It's like one day I'm writing about this visceral scene with my stepdad in the hot tub, and the next day it's my first marriage, the connective tissue was honestly lost to me. But I knew that all of it mattered, right? It was like, but then the question comes, well, how do these things hang together? And it was years before I could look at what I had written in black and white with enough distance in front of me to finally see it through the eyes of a trauma therapist and go, I have complex PTSD and I didn't even know it. And I think that was the other thing where I was like, if I have all this information and I talk about this stuff all day long and I couldn't see how it was happening in my own life, even in this moment, how many people are walking around with a similar experience? And so it was the connective tissue that I wanted to offer. Not just the information. There's a ton of great information out there, but I'm not going to avail myself of that information if I don't even know that it belongs to me. That's the self-gaslighting piece. Like, that stuff is for other people. No, it's for me and apparently you and so many of us.
Yes, absolutely. And so how long did it take for you to finish your memoir?
It was basically 5 years, maybe 5.5. Yeah. And, one of my magical thinking, but also musts, I would say, is that I was like, I will never publish this if it's not published by a big 5 publisher. And what I thought that meant, particularly as a trauma survivor, to be like, it's not a valid story unless a publishing house tells me that it's a valid story. It was like, I needed that. I needed that for a long period of time. But part of the healing in the writing process, it was like, wait a second, why am I still waiting for someone else to tell me that this matters? When the reason I've been writing it for 5 years is because I know that it matters. And right around the same time, the working title for this book for a long time was Maybe It Wasn't That Bad. And I loved that title. I was like, I'm never changing that title. But at a certain point, I was like, but that title is sitting in the self-gaslighting place. That title is sitting in the doubting place. And that is not where this book took me. This book has taken me much farther than that. And yet, when the title of Believing Me, it was like, that's it. And then I was like, no, it's too declarative. It's too strong. I can't, like, it's still, if the title was further along in its healing process than I was in mine.
I love that.
But again, I allowed the title, just as the book had been further along in its healing process than I was in mine. It was like pulling me. It was pulling, no. This is what the reader needs. This is the story that you've told. And I believed it enough that I really could believe me. I love that that's how that happened. Not everyone's going to write a memoir. I certainly wouldn't invite every client that I've worked with to do that. But what I love is this, for me, the spontaneous act of healing that my body wanted to have happen. And the way, I didn't think about this in advance, even as a trauma, there wasn't a treatment plan, well, yes, I'm going to, it literally, my body wanted to heal and it found a way to do it. That was so surprising to me, even in this idea that it only matters if someone else says it matters. And if I find an agent, you know what, I queried over 100 agents, at least, maybe 150. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. And as the no's just continued to pile up and I kept getting that thing about the platform and all of the rest of that, well, as a good, compliant, dutiful girl in her perfectionism trauma response, I went and I said, okay, I'm going to figure out this platform thing. And I feel like I kind of did, and then I came to a place where I was like, why would I want to go back and ask all of these same people again? Do you think it's worthy now? Here I've gone and developed this platform. It's probably going to take at least another 2 years if I even find an agent and craft a proposal and do all of these things. And it was the shock of my life when I said to myself, I don't care if anyone else thinks this story is a valid one. I know that it is, and I'm going to tell it, and I'm going to self-publish. Honestly, Lisa, that's the biggest marker of my healing, that I came to a place where that not only felt possible, but that's what I chose. It still kind of blows my mind.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because that was one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about, is what went into the decision to self-publish. Because when I look at this book, it is of a quality that it could certainly be published by a big
Mhm.
five press. I mean, I definitely feel like that's the case. However,
Mhm.
the publishing industry is so complicated and convoluted and competitive that there are so many factors that go into which books get picked up by which place, and some of them have nothing to do with you and everything to do with like what's happening in the economy right now,
Oh
or
yeah.
what else
Mhm.
have they sold lately. And some people see self-publishing as the last ditch effort,
Right.
the thing you do because you have quote unquote failed,
Yeah.
or you choose it early on because you don't believe you can be successful. And
Yeah.
what I hear is you did all of the things that many of us do. Queried agents and you went through the no process, and but you had this reckoning inside you.
Yes.
And that reckoning has to do with the title of your book, Believing
Yeah.
Me. And if I believe in me,
Yeah.
can I write the check on my book? Quite literally by
Yeah.
self-publishing.
Yes. Yes. I think I also realized the business aspect of it, that publishing is looking at, well, what's been selling, right? Because I need to make sure that I sell this. And they were like, well, your PhD, is this an academic? Oh, wait, is it a self? No, it's not really self. Well, you want to have a glossary? The memoirs don't have clinical glossaries. It was like, where do I fit, right? But I knew that that was also the reason that this would be compelling for the reader, is that it is a little bit different, I think, in that way. And I was healed enough. And I came to a point where I was like, I'm not going to keep begging for anyone else's approval. It was like my body just wouldn't let me do it. It just wouldn't let me do it anymore. And I do feel pretty confident, right? Like if they say, okay, go get a platform, and maybe I was told, okay, that's 10,000 social media followers and a mailing list of blah, blah, blah. I just surpassed it. I went way beyond that. And I do feel like I probably at that point could have gone back or found other agents I'd never queried before and found a way in that door. And I just didn't want or need it anymore. I didn't really care, and I also thought, how are they going to shape and edit my story that maybe does strip away some things that I still feel are really important, right? Like maybe the way that they're oriented to the reader is going to be too far afield from where I feel like I want to write for the reader. And I loved that I had that control, that I hired editors. Believe me, I hired editors, and I had beta readers, and I tried to do all of the things to help me shape it. But at the end of the day, that it was my decision felt powerful. That I said, what do I want on the cover? What is the title that I'm choosing, right? Like I got to pick my publishing company name as my own voice. It's my own voice. And each of those steps as a trauma survivor were so powerful. Like I said, even sitting with the title of like, can I really say Believing Me? It feels too big. And then finally coming into, that's exactly what the title is. And I loved being able to make all of those decisions. I didn't love formatting it for Amazon, right? But you figure those things out. And I don't regret it for a teeny tiny second.
And I'm so glad you talked about, not only did you self-publish, but you did all of the parts. So there's nothing wrong with self-publishing. And what I always tell people is if you're going to self-publish, create something that is of the same quality
Yeah,
as what you would see out there in a traditionally published book. Make sure you have editors, make sure you have a strong cover design. And the realities of how books are titled, you very well may not have been able to keep that title. I mean,
that's
who
right.
knows? But
Yeah, I knew that from my first book that was traditionally published. I had no say over title, cover, all kinds of things that were really meaningful to me. And, my first book, they're not comparable. It's so different, very different topics and everything. But from just the perspective of like a proper publisher and self-publishing, it took me over 10 years to sell 6,000 copies of my first
Mhm.
book, right? I mean, I've had a night and day experience with my memoir self-published. It's all over the world that I get emails from people in India and Australia and New Zealand and New York and Ireland. I mean, it's just like, it's profound.
And I want to talk about that part of the journey because, I want to say, girl, you've been successful. So most people don't realize that most books sell less than 1,000 copies.
I didn't know that number.
Yeah. Yeah. Jane Friedman has this paid newsletter called The Hot Sheet, and she talks about these things all of the time. And I think it was last year she had this post about how many books are selling, and a good majority of them sell zero, which it seems confounding. Like, how is that possible that they sell
Yeah.
zero? Because you at least
Yeah.
sell the, one to yourself. But so there, I think that means books that really haven't been launched at all. I'm sure that that's probably how they're counting that. But yeah, less than 1,000 copies. Tell us how many copies of your memoir you have sold thus far. And just a, ballpark figure.
Well, of course, I have all of the numbers because I get them as many times as I want them a day. Just this week, and I published just over a year ago. So it's October. I published September of last year. I just sold my 11,000th book.
Woohoo!
I know. I'm really proud of that. I feel like I don't want it to be about a numbers thing, but I feel proud of that. Yeah. Thank you for celebrating it.
You should feel proud of that. And I think, to me, like when I saw an Instagram post that you had, which your Instagram is amazing. I love your Instagram. And that's actually how I found you, was through your Instagram. What I love about this is that it's about believing in yourself. And this is the power of it. Like, it's not about the numbers. The numbers reflect the level of believing in yourself you have. That's really what it's a metric of. And that's what's powerful. It's not the book sales.
That's right. That's so it. You just nailed it. That's exactly it. And like I said, the emails that I get, or the Instagram messages, or handwritten letters, like the people that I shared this with you before we started today, that it's been really surprising. Well, coming from a gaslighting, self-gaslighting place of, my story's, not that bad, and it's kind of unique, and no one's really going to identify, and they're probably going to tell me that's not really traumatic, right? These were all of the fearful things that I thought. In this relatively short period of time, to have so many people reach out and say, you're telling my story, it's shocking, it's humbling, it totally breaks my heart. I don't want us all to be in this club, right, of living with this unmetabolized trauma, where I'll speak for myself. I genuinely thought I was broken, because if I had done all of these things, and I got sober at 21, and I went and I got the 3 degrees, I've sat on a million therapy couches, and I've done the retreats and the workshops, and I still, at the end of the day, felt like I was so fundamentally broken, and that is such a piece of the shared experience, and the shame that we all hold for having that, right? What's wrong with me? And I see other people, they're sort of living a life that seems impossible to me. That, to bring that full circle back to, it's not so much about the book sales, but that I waded through those waters long enough and deep enough in this particular way, like I said, pulling me towards something that maybe could be possible for me. And I feel like I arrived there, not at a finish line for all time, but enough conviction and belief in myself. It reminds me of that phrase that we use for parents, about being a good enough mother. We don't have to be a perfect mother. You just kind of have to be a good enough mother. It's like, I have good enough healing, that it's changed me, my relationship to myself, my relationship to other people. I will never, ever, ever doubt what happened, what it did to me, what I deserve. It gave me access to things that I never had my entire life, because I just didn't think it was possible. Healthy boundaries, clearer communication. I mean, it's changed my life. I'm so grateful for that.
And I love that for you, because I love celebrating your success. It's huge. And there's a piece of me that like, oh my gosh, that idea of feeling like you're fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that feeling so well. And it's, oh my gosh, I cannot tell you the number of times I've sat in my therapist's office, and I'm like tearing up a little bit right now. And I've said, it is so fucking humbling
Mm.
to know so much and to support other people. And sometimes to just get to that place where that it's not real brokenness, because I don't believe we're fully broken, but
Yeah.
that illusion of brokenness
Yes.
is ruling me right now. That my nervous system is not regulated the way I would like it to be, that I'm experiencing these things and seeing the outside world looking like it's going on magnificently,
Yeah.
and I feel terrible.
Yes.
And yeah, and I think it is about that good enough
Mm.
healing, that it's the both and, that sometimes you may still feel that way,
Hmm.
and that's okay, but
Right.
it's not like it was.
Yes.
It's not like it was. It's like a minor version of that,
Mm.
and you can claim your power, right? And I think that's important for people to hear, because I think so many people, and I can say myself, I felt this way, that there was this place where I was like, okay, there's going to be this point where I'm going to arrive, and then the
Yep.
healing's going to be done, and then I'm going to be a fixed person.
Yeah.
And you do not have, that's one, that's not realistic, but also you do not have to feel fully fixed, which that's a problematic term anyway, but you do not have to
Yeah.
feel fully healed in order to claim your power.
That's right. Because these are, binary, black and white, all or nothing terms that we're using. And I use them because it's how it felt.
Yes.
But the other gift that writing my story and seeing it through the lens of trauma gave me is that not only was I not broken, my body was doing exactly what our bodies are designed to do in the most genius way, keeping me safe. That's the body's job. It will always privilege safety and the connection to, even if it's like to the tiniest degree of connection, but that it thinks it can garner above all else, above my degrees, my opinions, logic, what everybody else is doing. My body will orient towards safety. And I learned these trauma responses, these coping mechanisms, things like the fawning trauma response of people pleasing codependency, the flight response of perfectionism and obsessive compulsive tendencies. It's like I'm an equal opportunity trauma responder. But that's what my body learned to keep me safe. And then, of
Mm-hmm.
course, it stayed there. It stayed there because that was its job. And I interpreted that as brokenness, but now when I understand that it was a nervous system doing exactly what it needed to do, I can kind of flip it. I can flip the narrative and go, thank you so much, body. Oh, the shame just melts.
Yes.
I'm not just sitting here beating myself up like, what's wrong with me? And why did I go, oh, of course I did that. That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much, body, for doing the best that you could with what you had, for privileging my safety. And now we're going to do it a little bit differently. And
Yes.
it's like this new collaborative relationship, me and my body. I'm not like dragging it along like this ball and chain, like, come on, just get up to speed. It just feels so different. I'm inhabiting myself. I'm noticing what I'm experiencing, that language that we use in trauma therapy all the time. What are you experiencing now? What are you noticing now? I can pause and do that and honor the answer no matter what it is. I don't immediately go, I'm feeling this. I shouldn't feel that. Nobody else
Mm-hmm.
feels that. What's wrong with me? I go, oh, honey, you must be overwhelmed, or you must be afraid. I can tune in and see what's going on, and then I can attend to it differently. And to your point earlier, this is a big piece of what the grounding offers us, right?
Yes.
So when you experience it in the writing, we can go, "Ooh, yeah, this is really intense right now. Where are my feet? Can I honor that this is really hard and brave, and be a witness to that?" And that brings me back into present time and place. And it's all these little things. The cumulative piece of all of that is a completely different experience.
Absolutely. And I think the ability to flip the script, to be able to say, oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
And it's okay.
Yeah.
I think
Here
is,
I am, and I'm
yes,
okay. Yeah.
yes. It's so important. And I
Mm,
remember there was this place when I was getting my clinical training where we would talk about reparenting yourself.
yep.
And I would be so frustrated because I was like, what does all of this
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And I took this training with Kristen Neff. I don't know
Mhm.
if you know her, but I took this training with her and did this soften, soothe, allow meditation. And it was
Mm,
the first time, this was, you know, I can't even think of many years ago, but it was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And that was the first time I was like, that's what it is. That
wow.
what you just did, this capacity to say, oh, yeah, there's the experience. You can be with it and go, oh, honey,
Yeah.
you must be feeling overwhelmed. It's a huge piece of what we need to be able to do just as human beings and also as writers when we're going through this process.
That's right.
And so you have done all of this marvelously. I'm so excited for all of the huge successes that you've had. And because your book was self published, you did
Mhm.
not have a gatekeeper saying when your book was finished, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes people, the finish line is like your book is due, or your publisher says this is the day it's coming out. You
Yeah.
didn't have that. And yet, there's a way that the story finishes itself inside of you and then it happens out on the page. How did you know your book was done, that it was ready to be published, and what did it feel like in your body?
It's such a good question. I mean, I was going to say I knew it in my body. If I went back up to my head to try to figure out, like, is it done? Do I need it? I would get so overwhelmed and confused. But a big piece of being done was my body, quite frankly, saying, I'm not going to do another draft.
Mm.
It's good enough. It's good enough. And then couple that with a couple of things happened when I sought out beta readers. I kind of had this, once again, magical thinking that beta readers were just going to, the feedback was going to be so abundantly clear that I was just going to go, phew, I just have to do what the beta readers want me to do because that's what the reader wants. And I forget what the number was, maybe 15 or so folks that I had give me this feedback with specific questions and then their own feedback, whatever they wanted to give me. And it was like with each person, the feedback was so different, actually, that I was like, I cannot do a revision that's going to meet all of these needs and wants simultaneously. And then I had a friend who had published recently, and she told me something that was such a gift. She said, if you give someone something to read and they know it's like not finished yet, they're going to read it looking for what's wrong. If you give that same text to maybe even the same person, you're like, here's my book. I'm really proud of it. I wrote it. They're going to read it from that framework of like, oh, it's a finished book. It's ready for me to read. And the experiences are going to be vastly different. And I was like, that kind of rings true. That's interesting. And then the last big piece, which relates to my mom, didn't actually happen until the book was with beta readers. And I will say some of their feedback was like, oh, things kind of feel unfinished with your mom. And I was like, well, that's because it completely was. I was still head in the sand, like I don't have to address this. And then life just happened where I did. And once that piece was, I mean, I was writing it in real time, which you probably wouldn't advise. I don't know, but because it was so fresh, I had no distance from it. But I knew this is the piece that needs to be talked about. I'm never going to be closer to this experience than I am right now. So I'm just going to write it out. And then I found an editor that I just loved and trusted. And I just said, basically, it's yours. She had maybe some changes like, well, I would leave this out. And if my body was so strong about like, no, that feels so important to me, I honored that. But with other stuff that I felt was, maybe more subjective, I was like, she's reading it from the reader's perspective. And I think my editor was amazing. She really helped with that arc and keeping it nice and tight and pulling you through from one thing to the next. And then I trusted it. And part of trusting it was going, I could have worked on this for another 5 years. I didn't want to. And I think the timing for my story, right? Because of my work on Instagram and things, I was like, you know what? People need this material now. We're talking about complex trauma. We're finally having this conversation, right? We haven't even added CPTSD to our DSM, our diagnostic manual here in the United States. Like, I wanted to be one of the voices that's bringing this material forward. And if I did another 18 drafts for 5 more years, it was going to be after the fact and it wouldn't have the same impact. So it was just a combination of all of those things, right? The perfectionist in me was like, you probably should, but my body was like, you're not going to do that. You're done.
And I think that's a really important thing for people to realize is there is a good enough level of done.
Yeah.
You know, I saw Edwidge Danticat speak in, I think it was 1999 or 2000 when Breath, Eyes, Memory came out, which is an Oprah book, right? An Oprah book. And this is an Oprah book back in the beginning. She is a phenomenal Haitian writer. And I just was enthralled by her writing and how amazing it was. And then I saw her again in 2015 at the University of Virginia. And she was giving a reading for some other books that she had written. And she decided to read an excerpt from Breath, Eyes, Memory. And before she started reading, she said, I would like to apologize to everyone right now because I would love to revise as I'm reading. And I'm like, that's it.
That's it.
And the thing about it is that if you read your book 5 years from now and you're not cringing is probably the wrong word, but you're not like, oh, I could have done this better, then that means you haven't grown as a writer. And
or
that doesn't.
I experienced that with my first book. By the time I got to the end of my first book, I was like, if I started this right now, I would literally write an entirely different book. And so I remembered that feeling. And I thought, yeah, when I got to the end of my memoir, I probably would write an incredibly different book, but that's not the book that my body set out to write. Maybe my brain likes to think that it can, weave a different tale in a different way that seems more interesting and appealing to me in the moment. This is the book my body had to write. And when you think about trauma as being stored even in this more primitive part of our, like, that's the piece that came onto the page. And so, yeah, I'm sure there are going to be, I could probably open it up right now and a part of me could go, ooh, right? But that was kind of the point.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I see people doing, and it's hard because the learning curve on writing is so long. There's so much we have to learn, but I don't think we're meant to work on these books forever.
Right.
In fact, I don't think it's healthy. I think it's important to understand the narrative and release it, as you just said, because the more you continue to go over that, the more you are activating your nervous system.
That's
and
right.
You're not giving yourself the ability to settle it and let it go, which is a huge piece of the healing process.
It's profound. And I'll say, if you would talk to me before I started writing, like the reason that these stories came so fast and furious is because they lived in present tense in my body as though they happened yesterday, right? So boom, 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 get them down on the page. What's true for me now is that the writing absolutely helped me reprocess some of these memories so they are not stored in the same place anymore. I could tell you what each little moment smelled like, looked like it was so crystal clear. Now, sometimes people reference something in what I've written and I go, what are they? Like, I could not write it the same way now because those memories have been reprocessed, which is such a gift and super fascinating. The other piece that once I published it, it did become clear to me, it's not even my story anymore. And there's such a freedom in that. It's not like you're handing it over. It did what it was meant to do for me. And now I can release it and go, whatever it's meant to do for you, I hope that it takes you there. And I love that releasing of it. It's like releasing doves, or I don't know what the metaphor is, but it just feels like, go fly, be free, do what you're meant to do. you're no longer just like, it's that straitjacket that I talk about in the writing, this internal straitjacket I'd been wearing my whole life. It was under my clothes, it was under my skin. No one could see it but me. And in the releasing, I am not wearing that straitjacket anymore.
Oh, yes. I love how you just said that because that was my experience too. Like my book is currently
Mm,
on submission, and that's one of the ways that I knew it was done is that I stopped feeling that way about it, and it truly feels like it's out there. It's for
yeah.
other people. And
Mm,
I often tell memoirists, because we have so many sensitive stories that we're telling, sometimes finished is that the work happened in your body and you don't need to do any more. It doesn't have to be published, right? So
yeah,
that's the great thing. It's like memoir doesn't have to be published. And
that's right.
sometimes it is supposed to be for the reader. And I
Mm,
think when you've done the work for yourself and you've settled the story enough for yourself, then you can make that decision.
mm,
Is it done enough that I can let it go and have some sort of ceremony where I'm still releasing the doves. Like you're never
yeah,
not releasing the doves, but you're releasing
yeah,
it in a certain way that is really for you, or is it for the reader? Because it's just a different kind of work that has to happen.
yeah,
But I think being able to let it go and live on the page and be for other people and trust that people are going to get what they need out of it, right?
that's
It
right.
doesn't, I don't have to have any expectations around the work that's going to happen. It will
Mm,
be whatever the work is.
mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you a couple more questions as we
Yeah.
wrap up. So, I don't know how much time we'll have for your Instagram, which I love. And the things
Oh,
I
thanks.
love about your Instagram are the ways that you keep it light. Like you're dealing with all these really heavy topics, but you add so much humor and so much joy into it.
Yeah.
How did you come up with this way of working on your Instagram? And how does that fit into the story you want to tell or the resilience that you have from going through this process?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think too, after my Instagram became a thing, people were like, it's so funny, but the book's not funny. And then I thought, oh no, it's false advertising, right? Like this. But here's what happened. I wrote the book. The healing happened enough that I could, in a very public way, and again, if you'd asked me this 6 months earlier, a year earlier, I would have said, I will never go on Instagram as a therapist. I would say, like, there's no way I would go on as a therapist and a trauma survivor. And then I certainly wouldn't do it in a kind of snarky, sarcastic, funny, silly, irreverent way. And when I even approached it, I was like, I'm about to tank my career. Whatever street cred I have is about to be completely gone. But as a continuation of my healing, for me to be all of those things in one place at the same time felt so important to me that I was like, I don't really care if it tanks my career. Maybe I'm not, maybe I'm meant to be doing something else. Let's see what happens. And so, part of what I write about in the book is that before I wound my way back into therapy, I was a singer-songwriter, I was a performer. And so something about this format on Instagram of the reels and the different audio that you can use, it's like it just allowed all of these parts of me to hang together, and it felt creative. It felt like it was healing. And then I would just go, if it made me laugh, if I wanted to watch it again, that was like the litmus test. I was like, okay, I'm going to post it. And I did, and people responded, and it ended up just being genuinely fun and creative. I think that's the other thing that writing kind of gave back to me, is that I'm not just a therapist, I'm also an artist. I also think good therapy is a little bit of art when you're doing it right. But these parts of me, they all need to live and be present in the world. And so now I'm just continuing that curiosity of like, how else can I create and communicate and continue to expand? It just feels like I need it, like I need breath.
And it feels really integrated. That's,
Mm,
I think, the best word that I would, because I think there's so much truth that you offer in some of the posts you have around the different ways that our nervous system tries to help us out that don't
yeah,
always serve us today.
yeah.
They're funny, but also true. And you have this way, and I don't know if you always had this, but I was thinking about this idea of when I was a kid growing up and the type of abuse that I experienced. I learned to perfect what I call resting robot face, where
Oh.
where it's just completely blank, because
Mm.
that's what kept me safe. And
Yeah.
so I've always admired actors and actresses and people who are performing at these big levels because
Mm.
they are able to emote the expressiveness of their faces. I'm like, my gosh, I don't know if my face could ever do all of those things. It's not
Right.
like my face is like that now, but it's just a level of connection
Mm.
to the body.
Right.
And I see that in you. And I wonder if there's a way that your ability to perform has changed as you've gone through this healing process and you've really claimed who you are and really got into believing in yourself in this
Yeah.
very profound way.
Well, I think the biggest difference, so I'll try to keep this brief, but I was very privileged to be a nanny for an incredible human being. Her name is Claire Wineland, and she ended up growing into being this public speaker, someone living with cystic fibrosis and terminal
Mm.
illness. And some of the most, to this day, magical, amazing, hilarious, creative moments in my life were with her in her hospital room, where we would take any found object, it didn't matter, and create a story. And we filmed it. This is long before social media, but it was just for us. And it was hilarious. And it was kind of that marriage of like, well, but she's in the hospital and dying. This should be like a really somber, how are you doing? And it wasn't. It was like, let's make mustaches and attach them to your oxygen cannula. Wouldn't that be
Nice.
hilarious? And so I had that part of me that I would allow to be as loud and expressive, but still within this kind of private space. It was the idea of being that part of me and someone who's supposed to have some credentialing and what that felt impossible. And I think for trauma survivors, these fragmented selves that live in these different space, like, who do you need me to be right now so that I can stay safe?
Mm-hmm.
It was that wall coming down where I was like, I'm going to be that Ingrid that honestly, when Claire died, I thought maybe I'll never feel that much
Mm.
joy again, because she brought that out in me in such a magical way, because it was just mirroring her magic, right? So it was this
Yeah.
alchemical, gorgeous thing. And I thought, I'm probably never going to feel that again. And then oddly enough, these years later, where I'm sitting on Instagram and I start laughing to myself because it brings out this part of me, and my brain immediately knows how to apply it to trauma and make it super accessible and relatable. And I just did it. And I found myself experiencing that much joy, but alone in my office, connecting with strangers
Mm.
online. And so, sometimes all of it feels super surprising to me. I could, like I said, I would have been like, no, I would never do that. And yet, oh my gosh, I did that. And I'm so glad that I did, both with the writing and social media. And, most of my life and my healing is about me getting out of my own way and what I think I should be doing and what's best for me. Like, oh no, big five publishing or nothing else at all. It's like, it's been a series of thank you for sharing, and I'm gonna keep walking down this road and actually see what life has in store for me, not some safe version from this prison that I've been living in my whole life tells me is the magical thing. That's, it's always been outside of those constraints. And so part of it is just trusting the call again, because that's what happened on Instagram. And then you get some feedback and people are saying, oh, that's so funny, or I loved that, or they love that I'm not pretending that, like, as a therapist, I have it all figured out, that there's a real relatability there, which feels so important to me. Again, it reduces the shame of like, but what if they know that I'm still a work
Yes.
in progress? It's like, please, everybody know that I'm still a work in progress, because you know what that lets me do? Exhale and go, whoo, I get to be a member of the human race. And so almost everything that I've done since the book, in whatever conception it was originally in, has been a deep extension of my healing. And it's felt like, oh, I'm meant to do this now. I don't think I can do it. I don't think I should do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I have found myself there, my true self there. not the self I was trying to become all these years to arrive at a place where you would think that I've arrived, because who cares about that?
Yeah. And
Boring.
it is. And I think people see through it,
That's the other piece. Yes,
Yeah.
it's inauthentic. It's inauthentic. I've arrived, but I'm full of shame. Like, that's what people feel. And so I think that's what people feel now, is that, Lisa, I didn't think it was possible, but I am not full of toxic shame, questioning every single choice and decision. And how am I going to convince them? How am I going to convince me? My life gets to be a work in progress and creative and playful. And I'm just trusting that.
And I love that you're trusting that. And I think that's something I really want people to hear, is the power of trusting that, and that it can take you where you need to go. And you can be all of who you are in all of the places. It may take work. There may be things you have to do to get there, but it is possible. And I think your Instagram is a beautiful way that you do that. If people want to reach you, they want to, buy your book. And I always ask people this, what's the best way for people to buy your book?
If you want the audiobook, which I've narrated, you can go to Audible and I think iTunes as well. And if you want paperback, ebook, or audiobook, you can get all of those on Amazon. Yeah. Because I published with Amazon. So that's the place to find me. Yeah.
And I want everyone to look at your Instagram, because it is wonderful and it's such a joy. That's one of the things I really like about it. And it's also so true, right? It's the both and. There's that authenticity. Is there anywhere else people can find you besides Instagram?
I mean, I'm on all the things. I think all of them are Ingrid Clayton, PhD. So find me Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. I'm doing a new thing on YouTube. It's called the Stand Up Therapy Variety Show, because that was another dream that I had, where I wanted to do longer form content and be even more silly. And anyway, so I've just done one episode of that, and I'm getting ready to do the second episode. I just recorded with Dr. Ramani a cooking show called We Make the Recipe So You Don't Have to. And we're making a trauma bond smoothie. And it was super fun. And I love getting to make these really devastatingly painful topics accessible, so that people can go, oh, I know exactly what she's talking about. Maybe that applies to me too. And then maybe they can go read more on trauma bonding, right? If they want, or figure out what the heck is that. But I'm going to show you by making a smoothie, because that's what occurred to me. And Dr. Ramani was game. And so, yeah, I'm just finding new ways to be playful with the freedom that I now have to do that.
Well, I saw the first episode and loved it. And
thank you.
I can't wait for the second one. And for me, I think the thing that makes this work is that it's funny enough to make me feel safe.
Yes.
Thinking, oh yeah, that's me too. Where I think sometimes the definitions we give tap into the pain. And then when we feel that pain, we're like, or we feel a lot of shame. It's either one or the other. And you do it in a way that's accessible, but also light enough that I can take it in. Right. And I think that's really what makes this work. And I think that's probably one of the things that trauma survivors really welcome, is that it's accessible, and that lightness makes it safe. So I think everyone should sign up also for your newsletter, because that's one of the ways that, you get access to that. It comes into your inbox, which I've signed up for. So all of these things will be in the show notes. So, you don't have to just listen to this. It'll all be there. So definitely follow Ingrid in all of the places, and get her book if you haven't read it. And I just want to thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa, for this conversation, and just your appreciation and your work in helping other people with their voices, and you also elevating your own. I'm so grateful to be a member of that club. And thank you for all you do to help us writers trying to get it down on the page.
Well, I think that's really the power in the work that we do. And as you said earlier, there is a form of healing that happens on the page that doesn't happen anywhere else. And to me, it's an honor and a gift to walk that journey with people, and to really see that, and to know that it's possible, because I've worked that myself.
That's right. That's a profound gift. I'm not kidding when I say I wish I had met you many, many years ago, but I'm glad to know that you're here now helping so many people.
Well, and I'm glad that I know you. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.